Oh, by the way, the guest is here, so we can actually get the show started and get the ball rolling. Um, Hello, Cafe. How are you doing, my friend?
Pretty good, man. Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear, my friend.
Awesome.
Loud and clear. So, before we get started, do you wish to give us a little introduction about yourself and let the viewers know who you are, please and thanks?
Sure. I, I've been interested in these topics for a long time. I've caught in many times to like the atheist experience shows and stuff like that, and I've had this channel running where I upload some of my own content and some of the calls I've made with Matt Dillahunty and other hosts on the show, and I've always went by this online name Cafe. And a lot of people, I guess, in the community, some people are familiar with my bailiwick, but it's mostly dealt with, you know, consciousness, altered states, whether it be lucid dreaming or psychedelic induced states, meditation. I've been interested in all aspects of altered states of consciousness.
Okay. Interesting, interesting. And likewise have I. I'm not going to lie. For quite some, well, not quite some time, but I would say within a couple of months now, maybe a little longer, I've been delving into philosophy a little more. I've been delving into qualia a little more. I've been delving into more of like the naturalistic perspectives of uh, consciousness in a sense. But at the same exact time, I've been reading what scientists have been bringing up and everything like that in order to get a full round understanding of, or at least try to get a full round understanding of where the where consciousness actually comes from. And it's very interesting to delve into it because there's a lot of individuals that talk about the subconscious as being the actual driver of conscious experiences and everything like that. So I would really like to delve into that as well during our discussion. So when we are talking about, right? Because you're stating, or last time when you were inside our comment section, you were stating that how do you know if Jesus didn't die a spiritual death or along that front?
Yes.
Do you mind elaborating on that so that we can be on the same page?
Sure. Um, I've been interested in what William James called mystical experiences,
Right.
and there's been a lot of research in that area. Whether it be, maybe you've heard of the Carmelite nuns that entered contemplation, and they were studied by fMRI, or the Tibetan monks who entered meditative states and who were studied with EEG, or even at Johns Hopkins, there's a lot of research revolving around psilocybin and psilocybin-induced mystical experience inside volunteers. And
Mhm.
so, what they're essentially doing at Johns Hopkins is they're giving volunteers a high dose of psilocybin, and the high dose is what the equivalent of what Terence McKenna called a heroic dose, and it's a dose that's necessary to elicit what they refer to as a complete mystical experience. Complete meaning it hits all six criteria and these markers that they developed over decades of research into
Mm.
this area. Research dating back all the way to the Marsh Chapel experiment in the 1960s, all the way into the more modern research with Roland Griffiths and his team in Baltimore, Maryland. And so what they found is that the induced mystical experience in their volunteers appears virtually identical to what mystics have described throughout the ages within the various major religions. So that Christ, the resurrection, the spiritual resurrection, may have been an event where this occurred. And so, it's been misinterpreted along the way, I think, to mean a literal death, but it may have been referring to this phenomenon, so that Christ having the direct revelation of the Holy Spirit, or even Muhammad shivering in a cave.
Mhm.
A lot of this is also emphasized in Islam by the term fana. This is a term that means to die before you die, and
Exactly.
referring to a spiritual death. You can find it in Buddhism with nirvana, in Hinduism with samadhi, Each of the world's major religions has a term to describe this phenomenon. And so, the researchers see it as virtually identical to what these mystics have been speaking about. And so they relate it to what's called the perennial philosophy. And the perennial philosophy is a perspective on the world's major religions that sees these mystical occurrences happening at the very core of all the world's major religions. So yeah, I really think if Christ was a real person and he existed, it's very possible that he may have had a mystical experience, perhaps several of them, that got him to speak the way he did and behave the way he did.
I would I would actually agree with that towards a certain a degree, because I think that there were certain things that people that were either taking certain substances, let's just say like like certain tribes within the Native American cultures that saw things or had what was called visions and stuff like that. I think that they were called eagle, not eagle visions, that's Assassin's Creed, but there was some type of visions that they would have when they would take ayahuasca or something like that, that would then take them on a journey, a spirit vision, that's what it was called.
Mhm.
And they would take them on that said journey, and they would do that as a rite of passage. So at least certain native tribes would do that. But at the same time, I do think that even though that there is something there, I think the issue is based on the interpretation of the data which is being put forward, I think. Because when we can talk about mystical experiences, mystical ex- for or at least as a physicalist like myself, I'm not going to say that you are wrong on the situation or right. I'm just going to explain as a physicalist that I find that it's more or less that the brain is not used to having these substances. It's not an everyday thing that people do. So when you are taking these substances, like the heroic dose, for instance, as you stated, or sometimes fasting for days on end, the body is not used to that. So, in a sense, the body tries to protect itself via hallucinations, via visions, via having certain things that, let's just say, that bring forth memories that they might have forgotten, but then don't really know how those memories came back to them because they thought that they were forgotten or something along those lines. And definitely, if you know Jesus's time, right, and even Muhammad's, and even if we go all the way back towards the patriarchs of Judaism, we see the tendency of fasting as being very important, but we also know that during the fasting experiences, there have been visions. But we also know if you don't eat that much, you also hallucinate normally, right?
Mhm.
So we have to look at what I would think is the evidential or the evidence, sorry, the evidence that's behind these experiences, and try to say, are these actual spiritual experiences, or is it only because a person has some sort of spiritual inclination that we call them spiritual experiences? But when it's somebody who's in the middle of the desert starving, for instance, then it's just a hallucination. Like, I think that's where we got to would juggle with that information and towards a certain extent.
Mhm. Well, are you familiar at all with Terence McKenna's stone date hypothesis? Um,
I've read a bit, but I'm not going to say that I've read a lot. So if you want, please
sure.
explain.
Let me see if I could condense it. Basically, he had this notion that it may have been our involvement about 100 to 200,000 years ago with psilocybin mushrooms that were when we were on the African veldt as when we were apes, when we encountered the mushroom, we developed a symbiotic relationship to the psychedelic that launched us into the human consciousness we know today, that we became self-reflective human beings because of that catalyst. And so, if that's the case, then it may be that, because I don't know if it's really a protective thing in the brain. It may be that the brain is set up to have these experiences. I mean, even at the research in Johns Hopkins, they say that these are biologically normal. This is a biologically normal phenomenon. And, they even speculate that even in the case of fasting or in meditation, what may be happening is a release of endogenous DMT, which our own bodies produce naturally. And the whole reason why psychedelics have such a profound effect on consciousness is because our neural receptors are basically set up to like a lock and key fit with these compounds. If you look at psilocybin, if you look at the chemical structure, I don't know if you've seen those hexagonal chemical structures.
Yeah.
If you compare psilocybin to DMT, they almost map twin-like to each other when you put them over. So they're very congruent in their chemical structure. Or even when someone vapes DMT, if they don't take it in the form of ayahuasca and they vape it, it's very rapid. It lasts 5 to 10 minutes, and it kind of gave Terence McKenna the idea that the body knows exactly what to do with this. It wouldn't be so quickly metabolized if it didn't. And so I think it may be part of our evolutionary biology, relative to our receptors and how we react to these compounds. It may not be because I've heard the theory that it may be a defense mechanism as well. That when you're dying, your DMT is released to help you in the process of death as a kind of defense mechanism. But I think these things really need to be studied more, and they are being studied. If you're paying attention to any of the psychedelic science out there, they refer to this whole phenomenon of psychedelic research blowing up all over the world as the psychedelic renaissance. And so, yeah, there's research going on right now, not just at Johns Hopkins, but in the UK, in California. There's psychedelic research pretty much blowing up all over the world right now.
No, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that it's not something that is, how could I say it? That
Innate.
our brains do not necessarily, yeah, innate. Thank you. That it's not necessarily innate. But what I am thinking about, for in certain cases at least, is that when we are looking at DMT, or when our brain releases adrenaline, for instance, we have the tendency, right, to want to think, or let's just say, for instance, if we're looking down a dark alley and something tells you that, you know what, don't go down there, we have a feeling that something is interacting with us, something otherworldly is interacting with us. But I feel that there's so much not known about the subconscious as of yet that we can't necessarily lean one way or the other, in a sense. And if we really want to be, and just like with me being a physicalist and everything like that, let alone a naturalist, I think that, well, we need to look at the naturalist perspective first before we can even jump to conclusions to any type of spiritualist phenomenon. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the spiritualist is wrong based on their analysis. I'm not saying that at all. But I think that it might be a bit of a skip and a jump ahead of the actual research which is being done. And I think that before anybody should have any statement on thinking that something is or is not a spiritual experience, we got to look at, as I stated, the phenomena as a whole, and look at phenomena from individuals that are believing that they're seeing water from a hallucination, or somebody who's having a spiritual experience that believes that there's some sort of transcendental self, or transcendental, or ego death, for instance, that is out there, in a sense. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't necessarily agree with ego death, but I find it very hard to comprehend it in a way, because the you is still there. You are experiencing the phenomena which is around you. So the ego is also taken along on this trip or on this ride. As soon as the I has a tendency to transcend, then that's where we no longer have the I. But a lot of times, whenever I hear people talk about these experiences, they always talk about the I. Now, you could say that it's based on the way that we speak, and that is true. But the reality of the situation is that if you were experiencing this, then the ego, which is the I, is still experiencing the phenomena before its very eyes. If that makes any sense.
I can try to tackle that, man. I think it may just be a semantic issue here because, even when these researchers use a term like mystical experience, they're not referring to something like supernatural in the sense of like defying the laws of physics. And they will use mystical interchangeably with religious or spiritual experience. And so, we have to, I mean, it's unfortunate that we kind of have this language that sounds airy fairy, but that they definitely don't mean something airy fairy by it. It's just that they have to label this phenomenon something. Unfortunately, this is the term that stuck, William James terms, mystical experience, and a lot of people do get connotations that this sounds like something supernatural in the sense of, like I said, like define the laws of physics. But even the researchers emphasize that this is a biologically normal phenomenon. This is something that's uh, completely natural to human beings. And so I think the issue might just be semantic in that people invoke maybe spiritual in a sense that they may not be concretely using it in. And there was another thing you mentioned that I wanted to address. So you can make a because that's one issue that I called into the atheist experience once to try to inform Matt Dillahunty about this, and he says, I don't care if people describe them as mystical, I want to know if they're in fact mystical. And I think he was going back to the same issue of like, it does it mean that it's magical? Is it somehow defying the laws of physics? And when you mention ego death, ego death, is a term that means that your ordinary sense of self is completely dissolved in this experience. And so, but I don't think you could really refer to your ego still being there if it's completely transformed. So that's why I think it's a matter of semantics. And uh, a lot of people will say, well, it's a subjective experience. I don't know if you ever heard this term non-duality in Eastern philosophy. But non-dual means, or a non-dual perception is not two or one. In other words, inside that experience, at the height of that phenomenon, you can't really say everything is subjective or everything's objective because the two appear identical. People will describe these very profound transcendental experiences. Of course, not during, if they're interviewed after the thing happens, but um, one of the characteristics is transcending space and time. This sense of all time, past and future, collapsing into the moment. And so and people will describe that in many ways. I felt like as though time froze, or it felt beyond dimensionality, or I had a fourth dimensional perception. um, and so there is this kind of a transcendental um, description that people use, but it's let me see, to use I think Jordan Peterson tried to say that it's a completely natural phenomenon, but within that phenomenon there is this sense of transcendence, and I think that's where maybe people have issues, or the physicalist or someone who adheres to naturalism might have an issue with. But have you ever dabbled in this yourself? Have you ever put it up to the test?
I I definitely have when I was younger. And the thing is that I have seen crazy things while utilizing certain drugs. It is definitely true. But the way that I look at it, and the way that I kind of perceive it, is that it's not necessarily a vision in a sense. How I see it is that the brain is trying to understand the information which is coming to it, and what we call this transcendental form, at least the way that I look at it, is that the transcendental form is predominantly all memory that is either within the conscious and even within the subconscious, kind of melding together but incoherently. And from melding together incoherently, it provides a quote unquote image that is before you that your brain, or your logical brain, or at least your brain, tries to logically perceive, but is unable to do so. So the only way that we can actually have these conversations is by saying, well, I had an experience which was transcendental. But I think that what we really start to feel, and when we really look at certain other information which is out there from other scientists that are also looking in on this, but then saying that maybe this isn't necessarily the way, that at least certain drugs have that spiritual type of knowledge, in a sense. Like, it doesn't give you something that is necessarily transcendent. It's just that it lowers your inhibition to such an extent that all things seem to kind of meld in together in an incoherent way, which just kind of blows your mind. And then after the experience, you're like, what did I just go through, you know? So that's where my kind of outlook goes through. But I mean, you can go ahead and.
All right. Well, I mean, a lot of people who do have it, they don't really describe it as an incoherent state. It's some people will say it's the clearest of the clearest, the surest of the surest, or more real than real, referring to the noetic quality that William James spoke of. And so, these researchers, when they gauge their volunteers for the complete mystical experience, they one thing that they noticed, that it has nothing to do with their personal history. It seems to be like a universal phenomenon in consciousness that they tap into, that that it has nothing to do with the detritus of their own personal upbringing, or things like that. It seems to they even refer to them as transpersonal experiences because of that. And so and they do reside on a spectrum. They do have volunteers that will hit partial mystical experience, is a term that they use in the peer-reviewed material.
Hmm.
And so you can and it's very elaborate. If you look into it, it's they'll even refer to uh, portions of this experience, like let's say you're the lower end spectrum. They call them archetypal or visionary states, and these can be unique to the individual. Like, if you're for instance, if you're a Christian, you may see Christ on the cross. If you're Hindu, you may see Shiva, so on and so forth. I wasn't very religious myself, and when I had this experience, I saw a vision of Bill Hicks, the comedian. And and so, like, they could be very unique in that regard. However, when the phenomenon begins to rise, or that you start raising the dose at the height of this phenomenon, it no longer becomes you relating to something else, like an ego relating to a vision or seeing something. Now they describe it as the Hindu drop that merges into the ocean of Brahman. There is a unity that occurs, and it's almost as though consciousness merges with all things, all times, and all places. And people seem to be universally describing this. Aldous Huxley, he once spoke of the reducing valve of consciousness, meaning that the brain in our ordinary state actually is filtering reality, so that it's we're not met with this onslaught of what's actually occurring, or this this background consciousness that's you can call it God, you can call it Brahman. And so it's actually being filtered. And so what the psychedelics seem to do is remove these filters, so that you're experiencing the full splendor of reality itself. And that may explain why people who undergo this experience feel as though it's more real than everyday waking consciousness.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Very, definitely very interesting. But the question, because I think that scientists, even neurologists and everything like that, uh, have come, just like with Sam Harris, just like with a scientist that I'm reading now that I'm a huge fan of, Anil Seth, an amazing writer and an amazing scientist, in my opinion. And he really delves into the science of consciousness and how we have our conscious experiences and everything like that through scientific analysis. And what he kind of points to is a physicalist slash a functionalist perspective within the brain, that the brain interacts with most of its parts while trying to engage with information that is coming towards it. And bringing back, let's just say, Jesus into the equation,
Mhm.
if we're saying that, let's just say that Jesus was doing certain things that allowed him to, how could I say it? Allowed him to have a higher vision of self. All right, Robert X, have a great one and have a good sleep. And thank you for coming by. If we are looking at this, let's just say the death of the ego, for instance, what this could possibly be is a subconscious experience, because a lot of times it's extremely difficult. Even scientists today are having a hard time of understanding what the subconscious really is, in a sense, and what allows it to function in the way that it does, and how it kind of tickles the intuition of the consciousness in and of itself in order to give rise to our perception, in a sense. And that's why the thing that I think happens is that when you push your body to such a limit, right? Because as you say, it is called a heroic dose for a reason. It's literally pushing your body to the maximum extent that it can go, towards a certain extent. And if this is the case, then it's understandable, at least to me, how the body kind of seems to, I wouldn't want to say restart, but it kind of puts itself in rest mode. And when it goes into rest mode, then everything seems to be clearer. And actually my father explained this when he had a car crash, for instance, and he was saying how he was coming in and out of consciousness, how he felt this warmth, how he felt this feeling of happiness and serenity while he was coming in and out of consciousness. And again, just like how you stated, even though that there have been statements based on the defense, how the brain defends itself, I think at the same time it's not necessarily the brain, or it is the brain, but it's the subconscious of the brain which is there in order to relax you in your final moments and stuff like that, because you're pushing the body to such an extent that it just can't go on any longer. It can't do that extra push. And then all of a sudden you hit it up once more and you're like, wow, what just happened? And I think that's exactly what the that spiritual experience is. Now, as you stated, as people are looking into it or whatever, we're starting to see at a lower doses that people actually put the faces of the things that they believe in. But the higher the dose, the more that it becomes a transcendental experience. But the thing that I'm wondering is that the transcendental experience is something that nobody can explain. Like I have a feeling that people are stating things that are relatively how could I say, ambiguous when it comes to that experience, because it's hard to explain. And that's what I mean by incoherency of thought, because it can seem in a way that these individuals have been going through a spiritual experience, but because they can't recollect that well, and it seems like the thing is it blew their mind, that experience that they have. That's what I mean by incoherence of thought. It's not necessarily that the thought in itself is just flashing random images at them. It's just that the experience is so awe-inspiring that they feel this need to call it either spiritual or something towards that extent, but there's a naturalistic tendency to it. That's what I mean.
Yes, I mean, I really don't separate spiritual from naturalism. I kind of see a congruence between the two. And what Terence McKenna once said, I don't think it's people are necessarily being incoherent. Terence noted that it's not that the experience can be detailed and explained in words. It's that it cannot be told, that it defies description itself, that it seems to be transcendent of our means of language, because we think of a language, we describe things in tense time. I did this yesterday, I'm going to do this tomorrow. but that in that state there is no such thing as, tomorrow or then. It seems that it's all occurring simultaneously, and I think that's why people have such a hard time putting it into a verbal context.
Mm,
It's that, um, if it could, once it's transduced to the word, it kind of takes away from the full splendor of the experience. I think the very point is the experience in and of itself. The only way to truly understand it is to undergo it for yourself. And there's, mystics, there's theologians in history. Simeon, the new theologian, he emphasized what he called theoria. In Eastern Orthodox Christianity, this was the term, for the direct vision of God. And he felt that every human being should undergo it, that it's necessary to one's spiritual and mental health, and that we all have the potential to it. And it's very similar to what the Buddhists are saying. And if you look at the Diamond Sutra, or even in Buddhism, there's they believe that all sentient beings have the potential to experience nirvana. And
mm.
and so nirvana, um, I mean, you can read descriptions of a mystical experience, but this will reading a description will not give you any insight into what's actually occurring in that state. I think the only way to really approach it is to have it for yourself. And it may be that everyone does if they don't have it in the midst of life, it may be that it awaits them at death. You know,
I mean, it could be the case, right? And as you stated, the number one way in order to go through with it is to experience it themselves. But at the same time, I have a feeling that that in and of itself is a dangerous experience as well, because you must push your body to such an extent in order to gain that amount of knowledge, in a sense, that you can have people actually taking themselves out, in a sense,
mhm.
maybe not necessarily wanting to, but because they're trying to reach this form of nirvana, literally having a suicide, in a
Yeah,
sense, though it's not intentional, but that's all they want to do is get to this one state. And I think that it's extreme, well, not extremely dangerous, but I mean, it needs to be done with supervision around, rather than people just trying different things out and seeing if it works. But let's just go back to the Jesus situation. So when we look at Jesus, for instance, you're saying that he might have had certain experiences exactly like this, right? That
yes.
he might have had these type of um, ego death experiences that allowed him to kind of interact at least with some sort of higher transcendental reason for life, in a sense.
No, yes. I mean, I don't know if you've ever taken a heroic dose for yourself, but one thing that I recall, I've made it. I was influenced by Terrence McKenna when I
Mm,
was 23 to try this out. I'm 36 now, and so I've been thinking about it for a very long time. And ever since that point, I would always challenge myself to do it every year after that. So I would go higher and higher. I think the highest I've ever took was 13 dried grams of psilocybin mushrooms. And yeah, which is,
Jesus.
I don't know if you've heard of Kalindi Ii. He advocates between the 20 and 30 dried gram range, which is even more intrepid. But um, when I first approached it, I did take Terrence McKenna's advice to do the 5 dried grams. And I guess that at the time I didn't have too much of an ego on me at 23. So it was easy to obliterate it in that experience. And one thing I do recall is having this experience of what I could only describe, what Christians describe as agape, as this infinite, unconditional love for all people and things. And, it's
Mhm.
just permeated everything. And so, I think if Christ did engage in these experiences when he would go into the prayer closet, whether he was inducing it naturally or perhaps taking psychedelics. There is a speculation. I can't recall the author's name right now, but he wrote a book on the speculation that the Eucharist may have been some sort of psychedelic.
Yes. Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
I know exactly who you're talking about. Okay.
Mhm. And so, this obviously would direct his behavior and his speech to speak in such a way to recognize this universal love and so forth. And There's even a recent guru that lived maybe less than 100 years ago, by the name of Ramana Maharshi. Someone asked him, "How should we treat others?" And his response to that was, "There are no others." Like it's all one. like so so this is the basis for the mystic that grounds morality, in that they experience this universal love. They called it the golden rule. Even perhaps you've heard that term, and it's
Yes.
the basis of all religious morality. And so yeah, I think it's very possible that if Christ was a real person, um, that he acted and behaved from perhaps having those transcendental experiences. And I mean, though, when you talk about physicalist and naturalist way of viewing these things, I really don't get where your issue comes with. Whoa, is it really spiritual? I think spiritual is kind of just the term they've had to recognize these ego death occurrences. Like I don't know where it clashes.
I see what you mean, but I think for us as physicalists and naturalists, our number one thing is that we understand that if you take certain substances, you fast for a certain amount of time or a longer duration of time, you go out in the desert for a certain amount of time, there will be hallucinations, there will be things that are seen, there will be things that will trick you, there will be things that will lead you to actual water. Luckily, or like most people, they'll just die in the desert or die in their surrounding without necessarily anybody there to understand what they went through. But I think where we clash is based on the idea that there's some sort of transcendental knowledge which is there through taking these or either taking these drugs or psychedelics, for instance, or taking or going on a fast, or I don't know, getting lost in the desert. I think that these are just things that might have helped certain people in a sense, kind of like understand maybe suffering or understand how other people are going through their own thing in a sense. And we do know also that through fasting, it does actually have certain effects on the mind that are both good and negative in a sense, or on the brain that are both good and negative, or pros and cons, I should say. And if that is the case, then we need to look at this not in a way of saying that everybody should do this, because then, like, look at Jesus. He was able to experience his ego death because he fasted and stuff like that for, I don't know, 2 weeks or something like that, and henceforth he had this experience. Where for me, I think that again, I guess with me it's twofold. The first thing is how dangerous it is for the individual themselves to go through that, just to experience something. Or actually, it's threefold. First, to go through that. Secondly, to want to relive that again, which then allows them to keep pushing the doses, which can lead them to overdose, which is very dangerous in my opinion, at least. And then the third thing is that I think that the reason why we clash so much is because we see two different perspectives from it, where let's just say a more spiritualist will say, well, this is a journey and this is something that can show you that we're all one. And I think that human beings on their own, without doing that, can understand that on their own terms in a sense. And kind of like the communists that did it wrong in my opinion, but still they had that inclination of this is what the working class people should do in order to have this universal brotherhood. But I don't think Marx did the heroic dose or anything like that, or fasted for days in order to come up with his hypothesis or theorem. And I think the last thing that we clash on is that it is a tendency of either godhood or nirvana and other things like that. Because as an atheist, as a naturalist, and as a physicalist, I do not perceive a soul. That doesn't mean that there isn't one there, but out of all the things that I have looked up so far in order to try to understand a soul through a naturalistic perspective, it seems that the tendency of a soul isn't there. We don't see anything that is soul like, in a sense. That doesn't mean that it's not there. It's just that at this very moment in time, our science is kind of showing that people who say that they have out of body experiences actually don't have out of body experiences because of certain tests that they do based on that and everything like that. So it makes it extremely difficult in order to gain the person's perspective of this out of body experience in the first place. And then when you tack on the extent of godhood to that, I think that's where the major clash comes from, because we're describing an unknown process and attaching something of great meaning to it where there might not be any meaning that is attached to it. I think that's where the clash really comes from.
Oh, let me see. I could try to address some of that.
Sure.
The Taoist sage in the Tao Te Ching, I think one of the first lines is, the name that can be named is not the eternal name. And what they mean that by that is that we may come to call it God or Brahman. You may believe in evolution as being a naturalist or a physicalist.
Hmm.
The term God itself, I don't know if you've ever looked into the etymology. Etymology, as probably know, is the history of a term.
Hmm.
And so if you look into the history of the word God, for instance, if you believe in evolution, obviously the term God hadn't always existed forever. It appeared sometime in the whenever we developed language. And
Exactly.
and so even before people were uttering the word God, if you look into Hinduism is a very old religion. It has roots dating back 10,000 BC. And so obviously at that time the word God didn't exist. They would refer to the divine as Brahman. And so uh, when I think of this, I don't know if I see the soul as some kind of like separate entity from the body, or I think we kind of develop ghosts in our language. And what I mean by that is that if you look at the etymology of the word soul,
Hmm.
it derives from psyche or psyche, from the Greek philosophers, and they were referring to consciousness itself. And of course you wouldn't say that consciousness doesn't exist. And I equate the soul to one's consciousness. I don't really see it as some kind of separate entity from that. And so let me see, what am I getting at? I had a point that I'm trying to get at here. uh, I guess I don't perceive these things in a separate way. Another thing that I guess a lot of maybe physicalists might say is that referring to consciousness is that consciousness is generated by the brain, or you could say the subconscious, or so forth. A lot of people who develop or have this experience, they kind of develop a different perception on that. Like maybe you've heard Graham Hancock. He
Mm.
talks about, he says, I no longer believe that consciousness is generated by the brain. He believes that the brain is more like a receiver for consciousness. So, like, a lot of atheists I've heard will argue, like, well, I've never seen a consciousness occur without a brain. I don't think that's necessarily the argument. The argument from a spiritualist view may be that the brain is a transceiver, in the sense that, like, the radio receives a signal, for instance,
Mm.
and so, but the signal isn't something that the radio generates. It grabs it from something else, and it portrays it as this station or that station. So that, let's say, you may hear uh, physicists talk about many worlds theories, or that that in this very room right now that you're sitting in, there's the universe where Hitler won the war, where dinosaurs never died, and they all exist simultaneously in the very room you're sitting in. But your brain is tuned into this universe, so it's like a signal that's receiving the perception from this universe. And so that's one difference. So, like, you have in one model, like maybe that a physicalist might adhere to, where consciousness is being produced by the brain in the same way that a factory produces cars. And so, like, if you destroy the factory, then you destroy the cars being produced. Whereas
Hmm.
in this other model I'm talking about, the brain is more like a transceiver, like a radio, where if you destroy the radio, the signal is still there.
That is very interesting perspective. But for me, or not for me, but I think that the more that we look at the science behind the, because that's the thing, I am not a neurologist, I'm not a psychologist, nor
Or
am I
neuroscientists.
a right, a psychiatrist. So the situation is that we kind of take our own perspectives based on the things that we read, right? And we take the perspectives based on individuals who say that they have the knowledge on the subject, and then we kind of mutate it into, and everybody does this, this is not just a theist thing, it's an atheist thing too. Everybody kind of puts that knowledge into their own subcontext in order to kind of bring it into either debates or conversations or whatever the situation may be. But I think the one thing that we need to do, because consciousness is such a difficult topic to discuss, and definitely with the people who have the knowledge based on consciousness can't necessarily get it pinned down that much. But the more that we see the information coming from neurologists and everything, and let alone psychologists and psychiatrists, we're starting, or the image which is starting to be produced in some level is a monist type of perspective, which is predominantly stating that all things come from the brain itself and then emanates from there. Now, don't get me wrong, we do have these individuals who are working with psychedelics and everything like that that are kind of seeing how they can kind of not get around that, but show another piece of the puzzle in a sense. However, the one thing that I do think is that consciousness in and of itself is such a difficult discussion to delve into. And even if you start delving into qualic experiences and everything like that, there's so many people with so many varying ideas that we can't necessarily pin down one idea as being 100% correct. But we can take from all other types of sciences that are out there in certain philosophies and try to match it with the scientific evidence. So a lot of things that I like to say is that the metaphysics need to match the physics in a sense.
Mhm.
And if the metaphysics is against the physics, but there doesn't necessarily seem that the physics is incorrect based on at least the amount of information that it has now based on certain aspects, then maybe the problem isn't necessarily the physics or the physicalist perspective. It may also be based on the metaphysics is just incorrect based on how we perceive things and everything like that, because we also know our perception is not 100%, and that a lot of the times we are left in the dark with a lot of things that we perceive. And that's why people can see a variety of different things, just like with color, for instance. And that's why, if we again get back into the Jesus situation, I feel that with Jesus, he might have believed himself as being transcendent because he did these things in order to have this higher, or he believed a higher experience than all other people that were around him, and believed that he had the right notion or the right way of doing things. The problem that I get to, because you might be right, and it might be written incorrectly within biblical context, that maybe Jesus did go through just an ego death and he actually didn't die at all. Who knows? Because that's the number one thing. The Romans would have written about that, of a Jesus figure that was that powerful, even in Judea, causing all these problems, that he had to have a governor literally decide his own death.
Mhm.
That there would be something written by the Romans. Sadly, there was nothing written by the Romans until 200 to 300 years later. So, if that is the case, then we can slowly but surely start amalgamating the information which is there and start saying that, okay, either A, Jesus did not exist, or B, Jesus did exist, but the thing is that he did not die on the cross. It was only his followers afterwards which attributed his sort of nirvana experience as his, as you stated, ego death, and him rising into a new form of thought process or something like that. But then again, for him to be attributed as God within the Gospels in and of itself, that's a completely different conversation to be had there. And let alone these translations haven't, even though they've been through multiple transcripts, for instance, and people transcribing them for centuries, the reality that I see is that I don't think that they're talking about a spiritual death. I think that what they're really aiming for is a physical death, that Jesus died a physical death, then came back from the dead, and that's why the tomb was empty.
Are you? I don't know if you've ever heard Alan Watts' take on this. Alan Wilson Watts. He's one of my favorite philosophers. He has a real interesting talk called "Jesus and His Religion," and
Okay.
he mentions where I think it's John 10:30, where Christ says, "I and the Father are one." And in the scripture, the Jews pick up a stone and stone him. And he asked them, oh, all these good works I've done, for which do you stone me? And the Jews reply, we do stone you not for your good works, but for you being a man, call yourself God. And then he quotes the 82nd Psalm and says, isn't it written in your book that I have said ye are gods? Uh, the implication being that I don't think he saw it as something exclusive to himself. And Alan Watts' take, Christ is as someone, a prophet who very powerfully, had this mystical experience and came to remind us that we are two gods. That it's not something specific to himself. And so, there's also the idea of kenosis, or self-emptying, that Christ had to renounce his divine powers as to become man and become obedient to death. And so, and if you look throughout history, I mean, he's not the only one that's been persecuted. A lot of mystics were, if they weren't careful with their language, and some of them were prosecuted. Either their Meister Eckhart theses were condemned. There's a Sufi mystics that were also killed for trying to express this. Or even Bill Hicks would say anyone who tried to advocate unity and love were killed. And Martin Luther King, JFK, so on and so forth. I think it's what the science is showing with the perennial philosophy and mystical experience. It's a message that in a sense unifies the major religions. It sees all the major religions as having a underlying metaphysical source from which they all derive. And so I see that as something that could potentially unite humanity. And so even mystics themselves who had this experience, they kind of saw beyond their own religion to see that, hey, this is not exclusive to me or my religion. This seems to be a potential in everyone. And yes, there are dangers, like you said. Even the researchers are quick to point out that if you have schizophrenic tendencies, you definitely don't want to try psychedelics, because it may amplify something there that you don't want amplified. But at the same time, they also have other precautions where they can they have a age range between 25 and 75 for their volunteers. 75 is pretty old, man. Like, so if you're 75 years old and they'll screen you, they'll do a health screen, and if you have a good heart and they see everything's okay, then yeah, you'll qualify as a volunteer to try the heroic dose, and they see no issue with that. And so while there's dangers, they can be controlled to a certain extent. And you know, and you spoke about overdose. Overdose. I don't know if you've looked into it, but there's something referred to as the LD50 with the compound, and LD refers to lethal dose. In other words, like if you have 100 rats, how much of the dose of a certain compound, how much of the dose would it take to kill half of those rats? And if you can quantify that, you'll have what it would take to kill a human being. And so when it comes to psilocybin, you would literally have to eat about 3.5, 3.7 pounds if you weigh 140 pounds to die from psilocybin mushrooms, which is almost impossible to bolt down. You
Oh,
know,
you're definitely like in that case, yes. But I mean, there are also different because in order to experience this or whatever, there are some people that will take the proper way in order to experience it, but there's other individuals that would try to take it into their own hands and be like, well, if I take this, maybe this will give me the heroic dose, and then sadly unintentionally commit suicide because of that, right? So we got to be careful based on the information which is being put out there and say that you got to be within the right circumstances and at the same exact time have the right professionals around you in order for you to provide or at least to delve
yeah.
into this heroic dose, at least, you know.
Well, no,
Eh,
what I'm saying is that um, I'm talking about 3.7 pounds of dried material. Like
okay, okay,
we're
okay.
comparing like 5 dried grams to 3 points. You got to remember, there's 144 grams in 1 pound.
Yeah,
So
okay, good point, good
okay,
point.
so like 5 dried grams to 140, it's far. You're very far away from a lethal dose.
That is a good point. That is
Yeah,
a good
and
point.
so like it's almost impossible to reach a fatal dose on these things. Like the way people die from taking mushrooms is by misidentifying the mushroom and actually taking a poisonous mushroom. And then if you took
Ah,
5 dried grams of a poisonous species, yeah, then yeah, your liver will become mush. There's nothing science can do for you at that point.
that's right,
Yeah,
exactly,
and
exactly.
so but
So
yeah, go
oh,
ahead.
sorry about that. But just one other thing too, because we do have one question
Sure.
from the comment section, so I'm going to bring this up. So, does Cafe believe the soul dies with the body? Then, so do you think that the soul in and of itself dies with the body, or do you think that the soul is transcended from the body?
From what I spend a lot of time studying comparative religion. I look into Hinduism, even Manichaeism, outdated religions that have come and gone, Egyptian religion, Greek religion. A lot of what they seem to say is that consciousness returns to whatever higher dimension it came from in the first place. That the soul. Terrence McKenna had this funny quote. He said, people are so alienated from their own soul that when they finally greet their soul, they think it's from a different star system. Like, but so I mean, the soul, even in these psychedelic states, consciousness at the height of these experiences seems to be something indestructible, something infinite, eternal, that cannot go away. And you talk about God. When you have these high dose psychedelics, what you're basically witnessing at the height of this phenomenon is consciousness with no boundaries, with no boundaries of time, of space. It's just, and that's what I perceive as what people may have called God. Is it's a consciousness where there are no limits. That's what people seem to express when they enter these states. That's when they talk about the transcendence of space and time, or the transcendence of the limitations of their body. um, and so that uh, that may be where the so-called signal of what Hancock talks about is emanating from. Even the Greeks, if you look at the work of Plotinus, the philosopher, Greek philosopher, he said, all of reality emanates from the one. The one is a kind of this all-encompassing. It encompasses every permutation and possibility that can manifest in the material world. And so like what we experience is a mere slice, a mere blip of that all-encompassing potential. And so if that's related to the soul, then I know, I think, just like I said, I mean, if the brain dies, that doesn't mean the signal goes away. The signal is still there. Like
Right.
he'll say, like, we wear our bodies like clothes, like, like you're not a human being having a spiritual experience. You're some type of spiritual essence being entrapped in a human being. Like it's seen from an opposite direction.
But that's the thing that kind of confuses me though, because if it's the other way around, then the essence, or let's just say the spirit, the essence,
Mhm.
the consciousness of that particular individual, which is now entrapped within this node, which is called the brain, let's just say, or
Yeah,
this signal, the the complications of that slowly but surely start to really surmount the reality of that, and towards a certain extent, right? Because a lot of times within science, when we look at certain things, is kind of like things, even though that they are hard to explain, if it has a sense of simplicity to it, then it's not that it's correct, but at least we're heading on the right and proper track in a sense.
Mhm.
And when we look at something that is more of a monist perspective, right, of the brain and of consciousness in and of itself, we can slowly but surely start to see that the understanding that the brain in and of itself is supervenes on other things, which are predominantly based on what you're interacting with, rather than, let's just say, being trapped by something, somehow being trapped within a physical object, and then only can be freed once the physical object is dead, in a
Yeah,
sense. Really does seem now, even though it seems counterintuitive, doesn't mean that it's incorrect. It just seems counterintuitive to at least knowledge, and at least to something that is non-physical, to be trapped within a physical prospect is really something that we got to sit and really discuss even more, in a deeper sense,
yeah,
than just saying that this is the reality. And then slowly but surely, as we start to unravel it, it's like, wait a few seconds, how is that? And then after, it's like, well, I don't know. And it's like, okay, that's cool. Neither do I. But if we're looking at it based on supervening, in a sense, we can slowly but surely start to actually ascertain that consciousness is based on the experience of the physical world and our interactions with that physical world, that constantly just builds up over time, in a sense. Where if you're saying that consciousness is something that just comes in, gets entrapped by a
Mhm.
brain like state, for instance, and then is only relinquished from that brain like state once the body dies, there is something, because there seems to
yeah.
be
Well,
something.
I are you familiar with? I don't know if you've ever looked into Eastern philosophy, like Hinduism. They speak of this. They say that the Brahman, which is that all-encompassing divine source, that it's eternal. It's they often talk about timelessness, or that it's immutable, that it's frozen, and the reason they mention this is that the Brahman uh, uh, is like the Godhead that's in its dream state. It dreams that it's every single entity. It dreams that it's you. It dreams that it's me. It's the grasshopper. It's the tree. And but when that dream is over, it awakens to what it truly is, which is the Brahman, which is all things in all times and all places, which is it always was. It's eternal. It's frozen in that sense. Another way to put it is, I really like Einstein's block universe. I don't know if you ever heard of the block universe, but
Off and on, I didn't necessarily read fully on it.
well, Einstein had this idea that everything is in predetermined. That he didn't believe in free will. So the notion of the block universe is that the universe exists as a kind of block. So if you, let's say, just as an example, let's say you consider the Big Bang, and you have another supposed event called the Big Crunch, which is the when all the universe collapses back on itself into the singularity.
Mhm.
So all that in between is what he referred as the block universe. That every single moment in time is already there. It's already frozen in time and space. And so while you may think you're doing things and having experience and you're making choices, you're actually just playing a role that's already frozen along this timeline. And that all the future is already happened in this sense. If you refer to the block universe, it's like the reel of film. Like while like if consciousness was a projector, and like a movie, like, and you see patterns, you see, you know, things moving and stuff. But if you refer to the real itself, the real is a physical object. It's already, you know, it's in the can. Everything is already in the can. And so
Hmm.
while you think you're playing out this movie, it's actually already done in a sense.
So
And
like
so
the script is already written
yeah, the
for
script
you.
is
You're
already
just
written.
playing the script.
Yes, and
Okay.
you refer to this as the block universe. I also have a friend. His name is he goes by Max Freakout, and he adheres to Michael Hoffman's ego death theory. If you go to egodeath.com, he expounds this theory where he believes that taking psychedelics, the high dose, actually gives you a vision of where your consciousness transforms essentially into the block. You know, you become the block. You know, like everything is there. It's all containing all, you know. And so like and you're the block for a temporary amount of time, and then when the experience is over, you return to your egoic self, this ordinary experience that we're experiencing right now. And I mean, it's a very interesting theory. I really like the guy, man. I haven't spoke to him in a while, but um uh, you know, so uh, the block is already frozen. That's why they speak of God being immutable, all knowing, you know, omniscience, all powerful, omnipotent in the sense that it sustains what's the block, you know, like an autumn. I think a lot of people have this naive notion that, oh, an all powerful God, like if he's a Superman with powers that can do anything, whereas in this idea of omnipotence, it's the all powerfulness that sustains the very universe itself. It sustains existence itself. That's, you know, an interpretation of omnipotence out of this description that I'm putting out here.
That
But
is
you think you're gonna add something?
that is oh, you wanted to add one more thing?
No, no, no. Go for it. Go for it.
Okay. Because that's one thing, and I do want to get into that. And if you want to be a guest again, we could definitely get into the actual block universe and really delve into that subject matter.
Mhm.
It's just because I love the conversation we're having now, but it's already we're 20 minutes above the time that I mostly end the
Okay.
show.
All right.
But I think that where we brought the conversation today, I think it's very interesting, and I would love to have a part two to it in the future if you do want to come back on.
Yeah, I'm down, man. Hell yeah! I was really glad that you called me here. I was a little late because I thought I was going by 9 Central. I didn't know that it was happening right away. You know, so like, I just
No
got home.
worries, man. No worries. It's perfectly fine. So just like next time, if you want, we can continue the conversation where we left off, and I'll change the name in a sense to about talking about consciousness because that's predominantly what we discussed today.
Mhm.
So I don't mind that. I can easily change the name of the YouTube thing and also of the thumbnail. So that's fine, and we can continue on that said conversation in the future whenever you're available, and then we can talk about the block universe and omnipotence and everything like that, because I have a couple of things to state about omnipotence in a particular way where I think it's not as consistent as even in that model is not
Mhm.
that consistent in a sense, because I think that it's actually limiting God's power by stating that that is the extent of omnipotence. Because if the block universe is the only universe, then we can kind of start to actually have that discussion.
Yeah.
But if there are other universes which are out there, then the block universe in and of itself can only be describing that one universe, but not all universes that
Well,
are
yeah,
out there.
that's why I mentioned the multiverse last time. You know, like you could, if you really want to advance this block notion, block universe idea, then it's multi-block universe. You know, like they're all, you know what I mean. Then you have no limits. But you see that that's, you know, where you could take it, and the reason I brought it up was because, you know, you talk about this limitation inside the body, the brain. If you're just an actor or a segment within that block, you know, then you're just all a person doing is when they identify with the ego, when they identify with their material body, they're just no kind of recognizing a portion within the block. They're not recognizing that they're in the entire block itself. Like, you know, the your actions are not truly your actions. They're the actions. They're just a portion of the actions of the block itself. So your true identity is not in your material body. Your true identity is contained within the entire block.
That is very interesting. And I really do want to get into that discussion because, as a naturalist and a physicalist, for me, the thing that I look at is that I don't think things are predetermined. I think things
Hmm.
it's in more in a weird position than a predetermined position where there are certain things that seem to have cause and effects, but I like to take the Humean route because I think the Humean route is the most sensical route into looking at how the universe or how we see cause and effect to
Yeah,
begin with, and that we really don't know. We don't have a lot of information based on are things actually causing and affecting the way that we think they are, or
yeah.
is it that they have an imposition of having some sort of effect when you do something to them? And henceforth, their disposition is completely different in the way that they interact with certain objects. And
Yeah.
henceforth, that's why certain things that we might think are cause and effects are just dispositions and the way that things interact with certain other things based on their consistency.
Well, you may be right. The guy I mentioned from the that expounds his theory at egodeath.com, he happens to be a compatibilist, so like even though he adheres to this block universe notion, he at the same time is a compatibilist, which the compatibilist sees no uh, paradox between free will and predetermination, so
Yeah, we can definitely delve into that some more. So, again, thank you so much for coming on. It was a good conversation. Thank you for coming
appreciate it,
on.
man. Yeah, it was
Uh,
cool, man. Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. And everybody who's on, thank you for coming on. Thank you for watching. I do apologize for the name on the description because we will change that into the right name in order to talk about consciousness and everything like that, and ego death in and of itself. And if the cafe wishes to come on again, we will then continue the conversation about consciousness and really start delving into it a little more. So thank you all again for coming on through. Also, I would like to thank our Patreon supporters, Linear and Tart, for helping us do what we do, which is have great conversations like the one we did tonight. And again, I hope you all a very good night, and I will see you next Saturday because we're going to have another great conversation with a theist, with another theist, and we're going to delve into another conversation with Jesus. Not with Jesus, but another conversation about Jesus. That's what I'm trying to say. So, anyways, again, thank you all so much for coming on through Cafe. Thank you again, and I will see you all next Saturday. And I have the wrong brand right there. All right.